Well, hello everyone, and welcome. Have I got a juicy session for you today? Um, I have recently come across a product which has really surprised me, and a colleague actually sent me a video, and I was initially quite dismissive. It was about something called methylene blue, and I thought, well, that sounds chemical. And apparently, it's one of the first drugs ever discovered, I think in 1876, something like that. It was initially a dye, a blue dye for blue jeans instead of indigo, chemically produced, but it was discovered that it had these amazing health properties. Um, and I've watched 3 times now the video with Francesco Gonzalez-Lima, who is the main kind of expert on methylene blue, and he's been researching this chemical for probably 20 years, and the number of papers he has is just phenomenal. And so he's well established. He's been interviewed by many people. In particular, he's been interviewed by Dr. McCullough, who I've been quite a fan of Dr. McCullough for years, but of course he's been banned now from YouTube for reasons that are to do with the current climate we're in, I think, and he's saying some unpopular things. But I don't think you can argue with methylene blue. It's been around for a long time as a drug. It's the drug of choice actually for emergency room use. If you have any form of poisoning, particularly carbon monoxide, cyanide poisoning, anything that interrupts the energy flow in your cellular machinery called the mitochondria. Now, it's very hard to talk about this, as I discovered when I was watching Francesco talk about it. He had a few diagrams, which I'm going to use as well to illustrate, but we have to start at the basics, all right? Because if you don't have any understanding of how we create energy in our cells, a lot of this is just going to go over your head. And so what I want to do is share my screen, and then I'm going to go to the picture that kind of really illustrates that. Here it is. All right. So here's your mitochondrion, which is a little subcellular organelle, it's called. It lives inside your cells. There are many hundreds, sometimes thousands, particularly in highly active cells, particularly in your neurological tissue, your nerve centers, and particularly your brain. But all the nerves that run through your body are very high concentrators of mitochondrion, and therefore methylene blue seems to be particularly attractive to nervous tissue. So it was also used as a stain, as you can imagine, to stain mitochondria for years before we were able to look at things in vivo, in other words, functioning in living tissue. Now, this is a diagram of one of the inner membranes. The mitochondria have these convoluted membranes throughout, which maximizes the surface area for chemical reactions. And if you take a slice through one of these inner membranes, you get this sort of what we call a lipid bilayer. So it's got a polar outer, which merges with water, and a lipid inner, which kind of is more fatty. And lipid bipolar membranes are very interesting because they allow selective transport of different things, because they have this both fat-loving inside and water-loving outside. Okay, now sandwiched in the middle of these membranes are a series of 4 enzymes, which are proteins that catalyze chemical reactions, and they're embedded in the sandwich of the membrane, if you like. Most of them extrude on both ends. There's a couple that don't, and that's important. And they're in a chain, and that's why we call it the electron transport chain. And the first complex, it's called, because it's basically a folded protein, but because it's associated in the membrane, we tend to refer to them as complexes, and they have really interesting products. They create a sort of catalyze a chemical reaction that involves reduction. So reduction is where we take electrons away, or we add hydrogen ions. That's what we're doing here. So we're kind of moving electrons across the complexes from 1 to 4. All right, and we label them 1, 2, 3, and 4 because that's the order in which the electrons move. And in fact, this this isn't quite accurate. In a way it is, but in fact it goes from 1 to 3 and then also from 2 to 3. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, but there are intermediate proteins as well that help to carry the electrons, and there are chemicals that are reduced in the process that sort of cycle. It's like a machine, if you like. It sort of cycles, and out the other end, what we get is we reduce oxygen to water, and we, in that process, we create the energy molecule, which is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Many of you will have heard of that. And ATP is the cellular energy molecule. It's the currency of the cell, if you like. And so this process is very tightly coupled. All right, it's not just a sausage machine where you put, electrons in one end and out comes ATP at the other. It being biodynamic, being a living system, it's very subject to inner control, if you like a thermostat. It can sort of upregulate and downregulate its own processes. Nature is wonderful. It's really incredible when you learn this. But lots of things can get in the way, and cyanide, for instance, will interrupt this fourth complex, cytochrome oxidase. It will stop that process entirely, which of course, because it's the last one in the chain, has really significant effects for metabolic poisoning. Basically, you can't produce energy, you'll die very quickly. And what's been really noted with the recent virus that we've had is that it operated very much like cyanide poisoning. And initially it was dealt with as a low oxygen problem, which of course it was, but it was low oxygen delivery and absorption. Not that people weren't taking in enough oxygen, they just couldn't deal with it. And so the initial treatment, which was to respirate people, just pumped in more oxygen, but it didn't increase the cellular ability to metabolize oxygen. And so people still died. If they'd had access perhaps to methylene blue, or realized that it was like a cyanide poisoning, we could have probably saved a lot more people. And that's very sad. Methylene blue is actually the parent compound for hydroxychloroquine. It's got a long history of use in malaria, antivirals, Ebola, HIV, for instance. It's an incredible compound, which I'd never heard of, which is astonishing. But there you go, I had never heard of it. I guess because I've never had the experience of working in a hospital emergency unit, and I've never myself had cyanide or carbon monoxide poisoning or anything that so interfered with my molecular machinery that I was in an emergency state. However, it has to be said, this whole process is also implicated in chronic disease like chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, and I think this could be a very powerful understanding and potentially a very useful chemical to intervene. Let me explain, though. There's something really important that you need to understand about methylene blue. It's a very interesting molecule. It contains 2 rings. Ring structures are really important in chemistry because they hold electrons, and the electrons are sort of held in a cloud, if you like, around the ring structure. Electrons are very powerful holding information and energy, and so ring structures are often involved in these energetic transactions. They're also present in foods, of course. When we have a food that's brightly colored, that's usually because it has a chromophore present in it, and a chromophore is a chemical that has ring structures that kind of hold electrons, and therefore it also attracts and reflects light in different wavelengths, because photons and electrons are very, very similar. Photons are light particles, they have no mass, and electrons have a very small mass, but they're very, very similar. And so you kind of have this ring structure providing energy and information, and this kind of resonance and high color. So that's why highly colored foods are very important, because they help promote the energy production cycle in this electron transport chain. But methylene blue, which is very blue, as you would imagine, as used as a dye, also absorbs in the infrared range, because whatever color it's giving out, it's usually absorbing in the opposite color range. So it's got a very interesting infrared absorption, and infrared is the natural frequency of light in the body. It's what we generate, actually, and that's why infrared lamps, for instance, are very powerful, because they change and enhance your kind of absorption and energy in that range. And so methylene blue would seem to be working in a similar way. Let's just show you, I think it's this one. There's this is one of his papers. This is the molecule, okay? And you can see this is the thiamine ring, and this is the imine, I think, or imine, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. What that enables is not only can it accept electrons and donate them, but it can also oxidize, auto-oxidize, so it can cycle between the ordinary oxidized state and the reduced state. And so it auto-oxidizes, so it sort of can re-oxidize itself. So it can adjust to levels of oxygen in the tissue, whether it needs to donate or accept. And so you're not stuck in one state or the other, which is what happens with many natural chemicals can't necessarily cycle, and this one can. But the other important thing to show you is it's a hormetic effect, which is dose dependent. And we know about hormesis because when we're working in chronic fatigue, we're looking to enhance people's energy respiration in their cells, but we can't overdose on energy. We can't overdose on exercise, because if we increase the need for oxygen and the cellular machinery can't provide it, that's when you go into crash. And so we have to really watch hormesis. You'll see it talked about in the biohacking movement, people going to ice cold water, that enhances this hormetic effect. Yeah, having bouts of exercise, that does the same thing. What it means is it has a biphasic response. So at low doses, it'll do one thing, and at higher doses, it'll do something else. And so we could say exercise is a good example. At low doses, it's really good because it sort of builds your capacity. But if you overdose on exercise and you can't match that with your ability to deliver oxygen to the tissues, it can be fatal. Same with heat or cold. And so this is the hormetic zone, if you like. It's sort of a reverse U shape. And we're looking for low doses in this range, which is usually around about 0.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. That's how it's measured. Anything above 2 is likely to be deleterious, it's likely to be dangerous. And so we have to watch when we're talking about methylene blue dosing, how we have to pay very, very close attention to how much is given. Now, I'm not going to go into that today. The other websites have done that far better, and I will include those in the description. My interest is really in making this information a little bit more accessible, because the original discussion was quite high level, actually, if you have no interest or understanding of biochemistry. So we know that methylene blue then has had this long history of being used in emergency room situations. But what Francesco wanted to look at was, how did it operate in healthy people? What could you do with methylene blue at these lower doses to enhance energy production and maybe reverse aging, increase neuroprotective effects, reduce dementias and Parkinson's and all kinds of neurological damage? And it looks like it's a very promising chemical indeed. Now, you likely won't have heard of it. I hadn't, because, of course, if you have an off-patent chemical like this, which threatens to reverse, it's a wonderful antidepressant as well, I should have said, according to the research. Obviously, I have no personal experience of that. But Yeah, you won't have heard of it because it threatens the model under which we run at the moment, which is that only newly discovered drugs can be patented. And this is a very, very old one. So it's off patent, so it has no potential for making fast profits. But it seems to have even less side effects. Well, it doesn't have side effects as far as we can see in this maximal zone compared to antidepressants, which have become, it has to be said, largely ineffective for most people. I'm not saying that lightly. We know that the highest efficacy of antidepressants, particularly the SSRIs when they first came in, was due to largely to placebo effect, because doctors believed in them and you believed in them because they were the latest thing. What we're seeing now is we call it treatment resistant. The vast majority of people, over 60%, don't respond to most SSRIs. And so we are looking for alternatives, but of course the alternatives have to be newly patented molecules. So this is why you haven't heard of it. All right. Okay, so it has this amazing structure which gives it this reduction potential. It's auto-cycling, so it reduces itself, so it keeps renewing itself, if you like, within the cells. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It has very high permeability, bit like oxygen itself, which is able to just diffuse into the brain. The blood-brain barrier is very important for helping us avoid toxicity in the brain. And obviously we don't want molecules to just transfer willy-nilly into the brain, because they would accumulate there because it's very fatty tissue. So usually there's a very strong mechanism for keeping things separate out of the bloodstream and not entering the blood. So that's what the blood-brain barrier is. It's sorry, not entering the brain. So you've got high permeability, and it doesn't lead to oxidant stress. So other molecules which could be considered electron donors can encourage this. Let's go back to the electron transport chain. Can encourage this to the point where the system can no longer cope, and you get poisoning, basically. If you haven't got enough antioxidant capacity, you get high oxidation. That in itself is damaging. So methylene blue seems to be able to do both things simultaneously: auto-oxidize and donate electrons. So it's a very, very interesting molecule. And it optimizes, therefore, cellular respiration, because this is what this is. It's often called oxidative phosphorylation, because the ATP molecule has phosphate groups which are added on. That's what ATP is. It's adenosine and with 3 phosphates, triphosphate. But it's better to think of it as a respiration process, because it's creating water from oxygen. We tend to think of respiration as what we do when we breathe, but at a cellular level, this is what's going on. All right. So could it enhance cellular respiration in healthy animals? Well, yes, apparently so. And both animal models, usually rats, and human models have shown that. So it's not just an antidote for poisoning. It can actually help on many levels to enhance your metabolic production of oxygen, which of course is going to give you more energy. It's going to enable healing. It's actually going to boost your memory, because memory and brain functioning is massive user of energy. So it has another function which really blew me away. Okay, and I need to go down to the lower part of this paper, which, here we go. So this is a wonderful image. This is a synapse. So this is neurons have a gap between one neuron and another to facilitate neurotransmission. So the transmission of a signal across the gap is done both chemically and electrically. And we have things called neurotransmitters. You'll probably be aware of serotonin. That's the one that SSRIs kind of target, but there's also excitatory ones like glutamate, which are ones that really light you up. And here in both ends of the neurological tissue, the axons and dendrons, there are these little mitochondria, and there'll be many more than are shown here. And what happens is the energy needed to send the molecules of neurotransmitter across the gap is why the mitochondria are there. They need to help facilitate that. What methylene blue also seems to do, apart from enhancing mitochondrial energy in both pre and post-synaptic mitochondria, it also helps to produce more of the enzymes in the electron transport chain. Remember this four protein enzyme complex. And how do proteins get produced? They get produced from DNA, from getting our genes read and becoming RNA, and then protein is made from RNA. And so if something promotes more gene expression of specific enzymes that are important for energy production and receptors on these synaptic membranes, then we're going to have another boosting of energy, but not just a short-term one, but a much longer-term one. And that's what he was saying, was that if you boost gene expression, then you're going to boost energy production longer term, so the day after and the day after that. Now, with chronic fatigue, we see exercise, it's often called post-exertional malaise for that reason, is that the demand has outstripped the supply, and then the next day you are on the floor, you cannot function, you can't think, you can't move. Some people can't, wash themselves. It's an absolutely awful disease, which is a kind of form of long-term metabolic poisoning. It's not caused by usually any one thing. It's a combination of things to do with your history, your emotional stress, your toxicity, what you've been eating, how much you've been pushing yourself, and so on. But it's not ultimately that you have over-exercised. It is that your system is not geared towards providing enough energy, and there are reasons for that, and largely emotional, as I found out. So this could be very potentially healing for people in low energy states. Long COVID, another brilliant example of a low energy state. So it's upregulating some of these enzyme complexes as well, and the receptors that take in the information. And so it's just incredible to think that this exists and hasn't been explored further. Now, one use it has been used for, besides emergency room poisoning, is before the advent of antibiotics. It was actually used as a cure for bladder infections. It was marketed in a tablet form and was found to be very effective, because you get rid of methylene blue by excreting it through your urine, okay, because it's very soluble. Diffuses from the blood into the urine, and it seems to then concentrate in your bladder. Now, of course, once it starts to concentrate, you are going to go up this hormetic curve a little, and it becomes pro-oxidant rather than antioxidant. Now, when we are trying to kill bacteria in any place in our body, oxidation and oxidative stress is needed, right? And so this is where it's so interesting that methylene blue could be both things. It can be antioxidant at low levels and pro-oxidant at high levels. Now, you don't want high dosages generally, but in certain circumstances, you need them. And that's why cells have a pro-oxidant capability, is because oxidative stress is needed, when you're mounting a fever, for instance, when you're trying to kill a virus or a bacterium that's invaded you, you'll need that. And what they found is that the higher levels that concentrate in the bladder do a wonderful job of killing off bacteria. And so better than antibiotics. And what a double whammy for the elderly, particularly elderly women. Now, my mum was in that category, and I can remember constant bladder infections, which would go straight to her brain. really affect her brain, and she would become really disoriented and start talking in the third person, and we'd just go, another bladder infection, we need another course of antibiotics. And it began to be virtually, she'd finish one round and then she'd have to start another. There's no real solution. If I'd known about this, I would have put a couple of drops in her water every day. Now you might say, what about it turns your urine blue? Yes, it can do. Depends on the dosage, and that's okay. You can mitigate that by adding vitamin C. And again, you need to follow the links below in more details of the dosages and so on, because that's been done by someone else. So anyway, so it works as a antibacterial as well. It just seems to actually allow this electron transport chain to just work better, more efficiently, and it kind of inserts itself instead of some of these carriers that may have got to the point where they're not working that well. So it sort of bypasses or shortcuts some of the systems until the systems can rejuvenate through the DNA, RNA, protein complexes being produced. So what we call upregulation. So the other thing, of course, to talk about is how it might help brain function, because brain function is very important. We see with a lot of brain fog, we see with depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD is a very interesting sort of collapse of brain function in some ways. It's very important to do it in a way that is coupled and controlled, because you don't just want to enhance function without it being self-regulating. And this is related to what we call the hemodynamic response. So you're probably aware oxygen is carried in the blood, in the red blood cells, by a hemoglobin molecule, and heme is another chromophore. It's a ring structure, has iron at its center, and it carries oxygen. It can also, interestingly, oxygen can sort of flow between this structure and also recently discovered in this fourth protein is another heme molecule, this time coupled with copper, which accepts oxygen. And so this is a new understanding which we hadn't had before, that it actually can be an oxidase enzyme. So oxygen is displaced from hemoglobin in the blood to this part of the electron transport chain. That's how it works. And that's called the hemodynamic response. And it can be upset by nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is usually produced in the body in order to vasodilate, to dilate the capillaries, Americans say capillaries, to bring more blood flow to the tissue. So this is the coupling that I'm talking about. So what you don't want is high amounts of oxygen, drawing all the oxygen when you're going to run out. So you need to couple, in low oxygen states, you need to bring more blood to the tissue. And in high oxygen states, you need to reduce the blood flow. And that's the function of nitrous oxide. And so it appears that this complex is able to do that and accept nitrous oxide or oxygen depending on the need of the body. And methylene blue seems to facilitate that as well. So it actually can facilitate memory and mental functioning, which blows apart the whole field, really, of depression and anxiety and trauma, of which I'm obviously heavily invested, because I work with people trying to change memory, to consolidate new memories over old memories, to extinguish old memories of trauma, which persist in the brain, and create new states of being where safety and flow are possible. And it looks like methylene blue could even help that post-treatment. Now, obviously, I can't do that because I tend to work remotely with people, but I could potentially recommend it once I've trialed it myself, because what that does in the brain is it makes the new memories stick, which is what we want. We want people to feel safe in their lives and not triggered. So another potentially mind-blowing use. And yeah, so I've covered that. The final use of methylene blue that really astounded me, and we're only up to the first hour of this presentation, is how it can be used topically, in other words, on the skin. If you have a tumor, a skin tumor like a melanoma, I've had basal cell carcinomas before. Elderly people tend to get these as their cellular machinery winds down, and the DNA starts to malfunction, and tumors tend to appear. You can inject methylene blue into the skin tumor and then subject that to infrared light. And what that seems to do is it sort of absorbs photons and has this oxidant burst, which kills tumor cells, kills cancer cells. So that's another use for oxidation. We talked about killing bacteria, but it can also kill cancer cells as well. So there's a lot of potential for that one. I'm very interested in infrared because I use it a lot in my own work, helping people heal. I have two devices. I have a lamp at home, and I also have a little device that fits up the nose, which pushes infrared in two different frequency bands into the parts of your brain that it can reach. Now, of course, it can't go into the deep back brain from there, but it can penetrate around the nasal passages. It's sold as a sinus clearing device, but it does a lot more than that. And potentially with methylene blue in the system, that could be even more potent. So I'm very excited to try that out. Now, folks, obviously, I'm not a medical doctor. We've got to be very careful what we say here. Nothing in this video constitutes medical advice. We are just reporting the research here and saying that this is quite exciting. And if people want to follow anything, they should contact their medical provider. But it is quite likely your medical provider won't have heard of this, so there might be some education needed there too. But certainly I will include the links in the description to the original video and also to the website that hosts some of the dosage information if you're interested in exploring this. It's worth saying that Dr. Gonzalez-Lima is well respected, and he has been involved in this field for over 20 years. So we're not talking somebody who doesn't know their stuff, and he reports that he uses this product himself and he uses it with his family. So again, he's got personal experience. Now, obviously, once I have tried it myself, I will do a little review on the site here, as I do with everything. I don't recommend anything that I haven't tried myself. I think that's really important. And Dr. Gonzalez-Lima obviously agrees, because he does the same. He's always the human subject, the first human subject when he's doing a new study. So I hope that was useful. I'm not going to include links to products because I don't do promotion on this channel, but you can obviously investigate sources. There are sources I found in the UK, the US, and probably in other countries too. And it's a very simple little dropper bottle that you purchase, a 1% solution, and then depending on your weight, you would investigate the right level, which is roughly 0.5 milligrams. And the bottles do normally tell you, because you need pharmaceutical grade. Okay, very important that you don't go for the stuff that you use to kill bacteria in fish tanks, or even the that's sort of industrial grade. Chemical grade is not good enough either. You need pharmaceutical grade, so that's really important. All right, because you don't want high levels of heavy metals in whatever you use, because that will negate the effect that you're trying to create, which is to try and enhance energy function in your body. All right, I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to stop share there, and wish you well, go well, and hope you found this useful. Take care. Bye-bye.